Clinical trials are stuck. Despite powerful AI tools, recruitment and patient engagement remain huge challenges. Today's guest, Denali Stahlke, reveals why human connection matters more than ever in healthcare tech, the critical need for diversity, and how startups can balance innovation with real-world impact. It's time to look beyond algorithms and reconnect healthcare with humanity.
My name is Denali Stahlke. I'm over partnerships at a company called Haystack Health. So we are a clinical trials software and services company, which focuses on patient recruitment for clinical trials. For those who may not be in that space, patient recruitment, so who's enrolling on clinical trials has been a challenge for, decades that we haven't managed to solve. And the organization that I work with focused on using machine learning and different AI technologies to identify patients within a population and increase awareness, determine if we want to get them on clinical trials. And so I oversee, like I said, partnerships in that space. So I work with life science companies, work with sites, community healthcare providers, as well as value-based care organizations. So insurance companies, ACOs, and the like, sort of collaborate amongst all three of those organizations to increase awareness and access to patient recruitment. I have spent the past this is going to date myself a little bit more than I want, but the past decade plus in healthcare IT in various different spaces. Majority of that in the clinical trial space is probably sort of the richest background I have in technology and services to support clinical research sites as they conduct clinical trials. And so, since 2020, clinical trials has become a lot more public and people understand kind of what that is. But I've been doing that for the past 7 or 8 years. And then before that, I was in the EHR space. So electronic health record space. And then way before that, at the beginning of my career, I actually worked as a clinical mental health counselor. So on the clinical side of things in clinical mental health counseling and providing mental health care to folks. That's kind of a little bit background about what I do and a bit of a winding path, I would say, to where I am today.
And what does your role currently look like in terms of what you're actively working on right now or any exciting things that are coming up?
So within my role, Haystack Health is a startup. We commercialized in 2023. So I've been with the organization about 18 months. And for those in the startup space, that means you have a whole lot of hats that you end up wearing. And so it's a combination of commercial activities, marketing activities, and partnership, and then a little bit of everything else in between. Right now, we're doing a lot of work sort of in 2 spaces, I would say primarily that I've been focusing on recently. One of the things we're working on is more of an account-based marketing strategy. So using some of the data analytics to create very specific and targeted messages towards organizations that we want to work with, as opposed to sort of with generic messages of this is what we can do and this is what we have done. It's using some of the tools that we have and doing some preliminary analysis to show very specifically to say, not only can we do this, but this is what it might look like for you. So there is just sort of a more of a personal connection to it that's not necessarily as generic. And that's been a really interesting activity. I think it's worked particularly well because, again, it makes it more personal. People want to see how it's going to affect them, not how some vague marketing quote is going to affect them. So that's been a really interesting thing that we've been working on, which, it certainly has its challenges, right? Like, how do we find something that's meaningful enough that isn't without, working specifically with them? So we're using generalized data to get some of these insights. So how do we make statements that aren't, too wildly, ridiculously optimistic, but realistic? So it's had challenges, but working a lot with our product team on that, which has been a really fun collaboration. And the other piece we're doing is developing sort of a consortium or network. And so this is on the site side of things. We're really working to develop more of a sense of community and an access consortium to pull together and create a community to help within the site and research community to sort of build out that network to increase, buy-in and engagement with some of that side of the market that we're working with. And that's been a lot of fun, which is a part of the reason I was running back and forth this week from Nashville to Houston. That is great. It was good. It's exciting.
Awesome. So with communicating and personalizing your outreach, I think that's something that a lot of companies struggle with, being able to get in front of the right people with the right message. And there's a lot of cold outreach happening. A lot of people get messages every single day and it's hard to stand out. So how do you approach communicating the value that you can bring and kind of cutting through the noise?
I think there's a couple of ways, and I think kind of how we landed on the technique is I get a absolutely stupid amount of cold outreach for things that are not relevant, first of all, or things that are like, I don't care if someone's like, oh, I see you went to University of Wisconsin-Madison. My uncle was there. Like, I don't care. I really don't. So I think it's it's also kind of like what's worked for me? Like, what have I found that I've been like, oh yeah, I actually am kind of interested in that. Like, what's made me double click on something? And I think there's all these different strategies that you can think about, like you tell stories or you use data. I think specifically in some of the spaces we're doing and some of the value that we're bringing is reduction in some of the cost things. It is very like number of trials, it's population, prevalence, it's very data heavy. And so you can always tell the feel good story. I mean, clinical trials, especially in some of the rare disease and oncology space, there are some very powerful stories about people who have had their lives extended or saved because of trials. And so you can lean on those stories. But I think because the value prop that we're kind of thinking about right now is a little bit more of that quantitative, having the hard data just made sense. So it was like, what are we even selling? What's valuable? And then what's going to tell that story best? It landed on data, and that was pretty straightforward. And then it was determining like, what can we provide value with without having access to that organization's data and being able to do a deeper dive analytic. So like, where is the personalization and value aligned with accuracy? Because I also think sometimes folks will be a little over optimistic or stretch the truth a little bit on when they try to start providing some of these things. And that also makes it unbelievable. I've certainly gotten ones to be like, we can increase your bookings by 200%. And I was like, how do you know that? You don't know that.
Yeah, maybe if you only have one booking.
Right. Like there's so many factors, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's kind of how we landed on what we're doing. And I think we've seen some definite interest in it. The other piece of it is also speaking the language that they're speaking. So if you're thinking about working with value-based care organizations that we're working with, they speak very quantitatively. They're numbers, right? It's a very numbers-driven piece of it. And it's also trying to crosswalk what we're doing in the clinical trial space with the value-based care organizations. And that's not necessarily something that they play in every day. So it's almost translating as well and educating like what we're doing, how that works for them in a very soundbitey way, because they don't want to read Excel files either.
Yeah, 100%. So what's kind of, I guess, an unexpected lesson you've learned then? Because I'm sure you've learned a lot about how to target people specifically, or outreach strategies, or in general, how do you make connections with the right people and get everyone on the same page with something that maybe they don't know a lot about? Like, do you have any specific lessons that you can think of that might help someone out?
I mean, the challenges have been education. I think that's been a big piece, has been within that specific space. My background, like I said, is very clinical trials heavy. It's something I have been in for about a decade now. It's just I understand it. And walking into a space where now that's not the norm, and it's about educating folks on it. I think what we've done there is identify who could be your ally within the folks that you're working with and bringing them along with you. So they might not be the purchaser. You're going to want to work with the CFO, the heads of innovation and strategy, who are going to bring someone like Haystack in. But if you think about who's going to be familiar with clinical trials, it's likely going to be folks like the chief medical officer. And so it's identifying it's not only selling to your buyers, but it's certainly making sure you're creating those relationships with the influencers and then bringing them along as well. And influencers, I mean by like buying influencers, not like social where you get influencers. And so it's like bringing those folks along, I think, has been something that has been helpful. And then, I mean, I think this is a challenge everywhere because no one is standardized. It's like, who are the roles? What are the roles? And like digging in. And some of it's just, like, I feel like oftentimes we look for quick wins and like, where is like the, hockey stick growth, and where is the way we can find like the, efficiencies. Sometimes it's just the fucking hard work. Like you have to find the people and you just have to dig in, explore the org structure. It's like that old fashioned like research. You just sometimes you have to put the time in, and that's what it is. So I think that's been a piece of it too, just grinding.
Yeah, I think that's something that more people need to hear, because it's so easy to look for the quick wins, like you said. And then sometimes the easiest way is the hard way. Like you try to find all the other things and they don't work. And if you had just stuck with the thing that seemed the hardest, but the most logical, you would have gotten there by now.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting. And I mean, I see this in the industry as far as like my role, like in sales and marketing. A lot of times folks are looking for like tools to make things more efficient, and what are the processes and things we can kind of like try to game the system to make it fast. And I see this in the clinical trial space too. Like we'll bring in a new technology, we'll bring in these things. And it's ultimately, sometimes it is just, you just have to do the work and you just have to build the relationships, and then that's what's going to pay off. There's not necessarily a trick to it.
Yeah. I think also because of the way that we're going so far into like AI and tools that can automate and all this stuff, the human connection aspect is kind of what's going to be left. You know what I mean? Like that's all that
Yeah.
we're going to really be left with. And I think that's where a lot of the value comes from because no one wants to be communicating via AI agents all day with everyone. Like it's going to get old. It's not going to be conducive. And I think the networking aspect you're talking about specifically is going to be so important because that's what's going to set companies apart. And I think, yeah, focusing on the actual human interaction is going to be way bigger coming up as well.
So that like reminds me of a conversation I was having the other day, which I think is spot on. Like if you think about like going on LinkedIn, you see all these people posting things, which is great, love it. But then you read some of these posts and you're like, I know you didn't write that. That's ChatGPT wrote that. Like, what are you doing? And like, so anyone couldn't do it, but it's like, you can tell when it happens because no one's engaging with it. Whereas like you get people who are just real and you're like, it's almost like, I mean, I know it's virtual still, but it's like a real authenticity to it versus having AI do it. And I certainly, don't get me wrong, I absolutely adore some of the things that you can get ChatGPT to do. It also can be really funny. But again, like the value becomes when it is authentic and human. And so I think that's a huge piece too. But again, I think people get caught up in the, oh, AI is going to do it. It's like, well, yeah, AI is going to make our life easier. Absolutely. But like, even though it can do it, also like can't do it as well, especially the relationship people piece
And
of
the
it.
input too, like you give it garbage in, garbage out. Like
Yeah.
you can't let it do everything for you. You have to leverage it as a tool. And I think I'm actually interested, how are you guys really leveraging AI in your technology to get ahead?
Yeah, so there's a couple of different tools we've used. So what we've done is I kind of describe it as like a clinical trials matching engine is what we've built. And the main sort of data sources that we pull in are patient data and clinical trials data. Clinical trials data is going to be the inclusion and exclusion criteria. So for every trial you can be on, there's a list of you have to have this disease, you can't have this, you have to be this, all of those things to make you qualify. So we basically build out a search strategy using a couple of different strategies. A priori searches. We have clinical folks on our team building it, but we also then have clinical data scientists who are then building algorithms and models based on that. And then basically we use a couple of different things to also then ingest different types of records. So we've looked at OCR and NLP functionality combined with machine learning to identify then who those patients are within the patient data. And that can be clinical claims, prior authorization, those types of work. And so it's a combination of different AI tools and technologies that we use to kind of ingest some of that. And then again, it's building out those like knowledge graphs via machine learning to kind of pull that all together. So it's a mix. And then I think, again, this sort of is, apparently this is the theme I'm talking about today, but it gets to like, we can do that and it's great. And we get a list of potentially eligible patients and we can even have our clinical team validate them, provide feedback back to the system. So it continually learns and iterates and gets better at identifying the patients. And then you have a list of patients, but like that's like half of what you need to do to basically get that patient involved or aware of the clinical trials. And so there is an element of just like rolling up your sleeves and doing the services component of it or partnering with someone who does it. But from an AI perspective, that's about half of what we do. And I think it's kind of the point earlier what you mentioned, like AI can do a piece of it, but there still is that human component of it. And that even like from an authenticity sales perspective, but even from what we're doing as an organization, still seeing that pretty prevalently.
Mm-hmm. And I know you guys do work with like DI and inclusive trial recruiting. Could you talk a little bit about the importance of that in clinical trials?
Yeah, so this is why I do what I do. There's lots of reasons why it's important to have, enroll patients in clinical trials. I mean, 80% of trials have delays in due to patient recruitment. 11% of sites never recruit trials, which results in delays. Sponsors are spending millions of dollars for these delays. Staff and research sites, are wasting time. But I think the piece that I certainly valuable, certainly makes a difference from an efficiency and dollars perspective. The reason that I am so passionate about this particular space is you think about for many, many years, I would say the majority of our drugs were tested on white men, which don't need drugs, but they're not the whole population. And there is a significant variation in how folks experience disease states and react and metabolize different medications and therapies. And so, for example, women have different metabolisms for certain drugs. Folks with different ethnic and racial backgrounds have different prevalences of certain indications and different responses to different therapeutic agents. And so if we're developing a drug in a single population, we're only developing drugs and therapies for that single population. So from a health equity perspective, if we're not including those folks in clinical trials, we're de facto not developing drugs for the general population. And this is something that is still today women are significantly underrepresented. Folks of non-white ethnicity and race are significantly underrepresented in clinical trials. And if you think about where clinical trials are being conducted, it's at these major academic hubs. And so it's going to limit the type of individual who is going to be enrolling in clinical trials. And so if we can access patients via value-based care organizations who have patients out in the community. I mean, I think about 80% of oncology patients are not at major academic centers. They're out in the community. And so de facto, they're probably not having the same exposure and awareness of clinical trials and ability to participate. So if we can successfully engage and recruit or even get awareness of clinical trials to these patients, it will help increase representation within that population. I also think for spaces like rare disease and oncology, not only just drug development equity, but even care access. There's some trials that, there's a whole debate in the industry about are clinical trials care options. I could talk about that for an hour, but I think in some spaces it's a little bit more generally accepted that, for certain oncology states or for rare disease, there may not be a good standard of care therapy. And so if we have folks who don't have access to clinical trials, we're not providing them equitable access to care. And that is pretty messed up. That's why I do what I do. I think is critically important across the board, scientifically, from a drug development perspective, from a care access perspective. And so that's why I think it's important to do, this. There's many ways to do it, but that's something I'm very passionate about and a big reason why I'm in this space.
Yeah. Are there any common misconceptions that you hear when talking about DI in testing, or is there anything that maybe you wish people knew more about?
I think I wish people knew more about in DE&I as far as in clinical trials. I think there's just a general misconception of representation in clinical trials. I think the first regulations that required organizations to include women in clinical trials was in 1993. And so if you think about all of the research and drugs that were developed before that, they weren't developed and tested in women, but that was when the regulation came out, and we're still significantly underrepresented in clinical trials, particularly women of color. And so I think that there is this idea that oh yeah, we have these regulations in place that make it so this won't happen. But if you go and look at the data, it is happening still. And then the other piece of it, I think, is an interesting flavor, is that I think there's a lot of mistrust in the research community, particularly based on historic events. I mean, there's multitudes of examples of folks in underrepresented populations having legitimately being abused or misused in clinical trials. I mean, you get the Tuskegee experiment is the biggest one you'll point to, where, Black men were getting infected with syphilis and not being treated. And that was in the 70s, right? That's not 50 years ago, right? So there's a lot of mistrust in the community. And I think a big piece of that also is you look who's conducting the research, which gets back to, why representation matters. If you don't have women and people of color conducting research, there's going to be a mistrust in folks who historically have been abused by clinical trials to engage in that community. So it's not just necessarily saying, hey, we want to recruit these people, but it's what are we doing to make this actually an environment where people want to participate? There's awareness. Yes, we can involve people, but I think it goes above and beyond that to say, hey, we need to get people involved to actually be engaging in running the clinical trials, to be engaged in the industry, because the representation matters, and you need to see people like you do it as you're going to gain trust in something. Which, fun fact, unrelated, I think recently just did a study where they asked boys and girls who would know more about science, like little boys and girls, and it was a big shift in the past 10 years swing, where it used to be everyone would say the male, and now it's little boys say little boys, little girls say little girls, which is kind of cool to see women in STEM actually making an impact. So it's cool to actually see, again, seeing women in that field. Representation matters and how folks move forward.
Yeah, I think the way that and I think I'm starting to see it too more so now, is there's a lot more awareness about the importance of this kind of stuff, because there'll be viral videos or articles or whatever about something that wasn't tested properly on the right intended audience, and it had completely adverse side effects on the intended population. And it's just crazy to me that would be happening now.
So the one that comes to mind this study came out in 2023, so a year and change ago, where it was the first study where women's menstrual products were tested using actual blood. Before that, it was using saline solution, which shockingly has different properties than blood, right? Just thought, right? So, and then they found that like actual labeling of like leaking and all of those things were like just massively different when you use blood versus saline. And so we weren't testing feminine products with the right substance. So now like all of these things that we made assumptions were because we just didn't do the research well. And like, again, it blew my mind. Like 2023, this was the first time we actually used real blood to test feminine products. Like that, like in that example of like testing medications, there's a bunch of research about like we tested, different things that had like legitimate adverse effects, but like something as simple as that, like we weren't researching products correctly, and which has negative health implications on how women are using these products.
It makes me think like how many products are out there that kind of just got grandfathered in, like assumptions that they were based on that no one thought to question or go back and check. Because I guess most people just trust that the products out there are tested and they're fine. We don't really go.
Well, I mean, there's another one that recently there was like a IUD device that was put to market that still had like a 5% chance of pregnancy, and that still had like massive complications of like ectopic pregnancies and things that took like forever to get off the market because we just hadn't researched it appropriately. We hadn't put the correct boundaries in place. We hadn't done what we needed to. And I think particularly in segments of the population that are not white men, I think the products and healthcare solutions that have represented those have been the ones that historically we've seen not taken off well.
Yeah. Do you have any, I guess because you haven't been working with this company for too long, but have you seen any measurable impact or improvement, I guess, in maybe recruiting people for a product that would have otherwise not been able to receive that representation, or like someone who got care? I don't know.
Yeah, that's interesting. So for the industry itself, well, without getting entirely political, because right now with the particular climate, there has been a significant impact from the new administration on DE&I initiatives in the US. So without getting too much into that, I will say there was a mandate that was recently, a couple years ago, came out from the FDA that said all trials need to have diversity, equity, and inclusion action plans included, which demonstrate how they are going to help close this gap we identify as a problem. And then it basically solidifies to say, hey, all drug company industry trials have to have a plan to get to these folks. Now, I don't know what the future of that holds, but I think as an industry, I am hopeful that we will continue to just do it because it's the right thing to do. And I would say in that timeline, I mean, I've been in the clinical research space for about a decade, and I would say, I think we're certainly seeing more organizations support it. We're seeing organizations come up specifically to help with things with DE&I action plans. As far as recruiting patients, I think, like I said, we're relatively new. So we're still sort of in the sways of. So I don't know if I have any like measurable objective like from then to now outcomes from what we're specifically doing at Haystack, but I am hopeful that it certainly will be something we'll be able to help close the gap in at some level. And I think bigger as an industry, I think we are doing the right thing. I hope we continue to do the right thing.
And then I guess in the future, what do you see, or what do you hope to see the industry go into? Sort of what path do you hope to see it go down, or what outcomes are you thinking will happen or hoping will materialize?
Yeah. So if I'm talking specifically about patient recruitment, I think there are some really unique overlays of where we could use AI as well as services and input to take the challenge upstream a little bit. I think a lot of what we focus on in this space, a lot of historically where the industry is focused on in the place has been patient recruitment. So finding the patients. I think ultimately, my 2 cents is that I think the real challenge with patient recruitment is we're designing protocols that are not for real people. And I think there's some probably pretty unique applications. So if you think about if I am running a diabetes study, but I say the person can't be obese. Well, how many people who have type 2 diabetes are going to qualify in the obese category? They're probably a good chunk. And when the drug is approved, they're going to be prescribed it. So it's balancing scientific integrity and getting the data outcomes we need, but also with who's actually going to be taking this, providing it down the road. But what has happened is we've taken the protocol design components of it, and it's they're not necessarily representative of real patients. And so I think that's a big challenge with recruitment, because we've defined patients in a way that isn't accurately representative of patients. And I think there's probably some very interesting applications of using AI to analyze the patient population to determine who should we be testing this on and designing the protocols, as opposed to designing protocols and then being like, okay, where are these people? When in actuality, they may not even exist. So I would love to see it taken upstream a little bit and using some of that analytics to define and better refine who we're trying to find, not trying to find the people who we've already defined. If that makes sense.
Yeah, it's like designing for the people that exist rather than finding people that exist to meet the made up cookie cutter from the start.
Exactly. Yeah, I think
Right.
it was in a conference last fall, and I think we came up with the tagline, like, we're designing protocols for unicorns, not people. And so it's like it's going to be a challenge unless we change it upstream. So I'm hopeful that, and I think there are some very cool potential ways that AI could help with this, as far as like massive data aggregation and feedback ingestion as well.
That's really interesting. I mean, even I guess like you were talking about earlier, whether like recruitment and trials could be considered healthcare as well. I think it could be interesting to see how, on a larger scale, maybe involving people who wouldn't normally have access or wouldn't even think to apply for these types of things. Because I think one thing is finding people who need the treatment but don't have the money, and another is maybe people don't even know that this exists. Like they don't even think to participate in a trial as a means of healthcare.
Yeah, I think that's huge. I think there is sometimes we take for granted. And I think particularly, like I said, I've been in most of my career, been in sort of like software IT side of things. Tangentially, I'm certainly not, smart enough to be a coder or a data scientist or anything. I just work with brilliant people. But I think sometimes what happens is we get in a space where we are developing like a solution or a technology that doesn't actually meet the need of what's out there. And I think it's similar where they're really smart people and like, this is the technology we're building and it's going to be great. It's going to solve the problems. But then half the population isn't even aware of what's going on. So there's just like a different level of like health literacy that we're making assumptions about. Because a lot of times, like I said, I love the people I work with. They're like across the board who I've worked with for the past, however many years, like lots of brilliant people. But I think sometimes we forget that not everyone has the same strengths. And so we assume everyone has the same health literacy, when in actuality, like sometimes it's literally just awareness. They don't even know what a clinical trial is. And I will say, I was talking this week with someone, I'll say since 2020 happened, explaining my job has gotten a whole lot easier. Like people know what a clinical trial is now, thanks to Pfizer, Moderna, and all the stuff that came out there, but still understanding like this could be, in certain cases, a potential care avenue, depending on what their profile is. Again, like oncology, rare disease, those are going to be a little bit more like straightforward. Like maybe there isn't a treatment, or maybe you failed a couple lines of treatment because you don't understand disease progressions well enough. If I'm doing like an atopic dermatitis, it could be a care option. It could not be. There's more of a debate there, but especially in some of those areas where, again, like you're talking about like mortality level changes, not just like how itchy my arm is, and people who you don't even know. And I think it's also true for providers, right? I mean, looking today, there's like 35,000 trials being run in the US today. 25,000 of those are actively recruiting. If I'm a provider, there's no way in hell I'm keeping track of how many trials are active in my community, what the inclusion-exclusion criteria is. So it's not even just patients, it's even providers in this space. Like it'd be impossible to keep track of all the ones that are running, even locally within a community. And so that's another thing, sort of how do we help just provide education and awareness of some of this, I think has been something that we also focus on.
I don't know if you guys would be able to do this, but I'm just thinking here, like, is there a way to connect people who maybe someone is like listening right now, they're like, oh, clinical trial, this sounds like the thing I need. Is there a way to connect people, like just normal people who aren't part of a larger organization that collects information? Because I know you guys collect information and then help facilitate between parties, but do you have any?
If I'm a patient and I'm like, how would I find a clinical trial? So there is clinical, like in the US, again, I will say like we primarily work domestically within the US. So I couldn't speak to necessarily how this would expand globally, but we do have an organization called it's a website, clinicaltrials.gov, and it's the aggregation of all the clinical trials that are actively being run. Now they also have all of the global stuff there too, so you could see that. I just don't know like how, if they're not in the US, how that balances. It's a website. It's It's not the most intuitive or easy to use. There are ways you could play with it for sure to find things. That's sort of a one, and it's always not like necessarily the most up to date. It's not like I wouldn't be like, oh man, this is your tool. Like everyone kind of gripes about it. Like it's just kind of is what it is, but it's a place to start to see. Other places would be is to contact, again, a lot of research is being done in large academic medical centers. So I think there's a couple different, like you can look on their websites to see what clinical trials are there. That would be something else to do. There are also organizations that you can actually go and search clinical trials. Say like, I live here, I have this indication. Are there trials around me that are recruiting? It's like With Power is one. There's others out there that do that. I don't know exactly how comprehensive they are. And I think that's a big issue, right? Like that's something that we've talked about at Haystack. Like, wouldn't it be great if we could eventually get a repository of this and be able to provide this just to people? The challenge has been, how do you ingest that level of scale and simplify it? There's other like clinical, I think, is another one. There's different ones that you can go online, but yeah, unfortunately, and there's been a couple of really good pieces on this, but we don't have a great one size fits all solution. It takes some work. But yeah, local medical centers. There's large academic centers where a lot of research is being done, but I think we're seeing a lot of growth in community research as well. So if you're looking at like site networks, is another one that you see folks looking at. So figuring out who your site networks are in your community. And those are ones actually that are pretty fascinating because their model is a little bit different. So you have academics, which move like academics. They're slow. They're less necessarily incented to be as rapid institutionally. You see site networks and integrated research organizations, they can be a little bit more nimble and might be good resources if there is one in your community.
Awesome. Well, what's new for 2025? Do you have any big goals this year, or how do you plan to tackle those?
Yeah, and it kind of dovetails up to kind of what we talked about at the beginning of the call with sort of what are our initiatives that we're working on. And I think really it is to, we're kind of at the phase where we've built the thing and now we're refining it, and now it's about sort of growing. So we kind of did the 0 to 1. Now we're kind of in that 1 to 10 phase from a startup perspective. And so I think what we'd really hope to accomplish is increasing our footprint in the value-based care space. And then I think establishing several chapters of our research access consortium, which is sort of that network of providers, research sites that we're looking at. So it is local-based chapters. And I think we're really hoping to launch and establish at least a couple more chapters this year to build out that sort of footprint and collaboration piece of it on that side of the house. And then, so that's from a Haystack perspective, that's what I'm looking to do. And then, I don't know, do more podcasting, I guess, and maybe travel. I don't know.
Love that. Okay, well, thank you so much for coming on. This was a lot of fun, and I learned a lot.
Cool. Yeah, I love it. I mean, I'm happy to have folks chatting. Please reach out. Happy to connect and about anything and everything. So find me on LinkedIn.
Awesome. Thank you so much.